Hello once again, and thanks for joining us for this Wednesday's edition of Alaska Weather on the 27th day of July. I'm David Percy. And our first graphic here, kind of a chilly morning in some areas of the state. Temperatures down into the 20s. Stony had a low temperature this morning of 24 degrees, and then Eagle off to the northeast or over toward the eastern border, 28 degrees there in Yukon River. And Paxson, Copper River Basin, 29 degrees for the overnight low. And then Salcha, east of Fairbanks, and Chicken, down below the frost point at 31 degrees Fahrenheit. And also Toledo, 31 degrees, and Kenai down to 32, as well as Marshall also reaching the frost point at 32 above, and Tok about 33. So kind of a chilly morning for the latter part of July. And fire danger, areas of high and now a little bit of very high showing up over the Yukon Flats there, as it has been. And the area on the north side of the eastern Alaska Range kind of expanding in the high category there, and over the upper Tanana Valley with not a whole lot of rain, although Fairbanks and upper Chena did pick up about 1/10 of an inch of precipitation over the last 24 hours. So that obviously south of that area, those areas in the blue there between the high fire danger in the Yukon Flats and then down toward the Alaska Range. Copper River Basin have some high to very high fire danger as well, kind of expansive there, and some high fire danger reappearing over the Susitna Valley, the sunshine today and drying conditions, Kenai Peninsula, and also northeast Bristol Bay, north of King Salmon, and on the north side Iliamna Lake. Otherwise pretty blue out to the west and to the north, as well as Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island. Satellite imagery showing a lot of clearing over southern Alaska today, all the way up. Start getting some afternoon cumulus, fair weather cumulus developing over the Copper River Basin and areas south of the Yukon River. We're just maximum sunshine, south central Alaska, Kodiak Island into Bristol Bay today, and those chilly overnight lows recovering quite nicely into the upper 60s to lower 70s in some areas. And also sunshine all the way out to the Alaska Peninsula there. And you can see moisture, band of clouds streaming northeastward, bringing rain, increasing rain, moderate rain at Yakutat this afternoon. Some of that's starting to spill into the northern Panhandle areas, and will continue to do so and push a little farther south tonight and tomorrow. And a system bringing rain and gusty winds out toward the central Aleutians. That moisture spreading at least clouds up to the Pribilof Islands and over to the Fox Islands, and a system up along the Arctic coast bringing some pretty good rainfall to areas of the North Slope and the Arctic coast, anywhere from a third to or a quarter of an inch up to about a half an inch or 2/3 of an inch. Some places even more over the last 24 hours, other places seeing less. But kind of a cloudy, wet pattern up there, chilly temperatures as well for this point in July. And running that through again, you can see that upper level low there off the eastern Arctic coast, Arctic Ocean, is going to be slowly pulling off to the east. Bring some gusty winds tonight and tomorrow for the eastern Arctic coast, lighter conditions before that pulls off tomorrow afternoon and evening. On the chart, there's that front out over the Berings, or over the Aleutians, bringing the rain and gusty winds to the southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians there, mostly the central Aleutians today, seeing gusts as high as 40 miles an hour. And then the rain associated with the warm front spreading up with the heaviest amounts, Dry Bay to Yakutat, carrying some moderate rain at times this afternoon, starting to increase over the northern Panhandle. But temperatures in the 70s over the southern southeast coast with a lot of sunshine today. Some cases pushing the upper 70s, and that trough on the Arctic coast, North Slope, keeping periods of rain up there going with cloudy skies, and south of the Brooks Range, just some showers extending down toward the Yukon River, but lots of sunshine, light winds today over southern Alaska from the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta to the eastern interior there, with some afternoon cumulus developing and some partly sunny skies also over the Seward Peninsula, High pressure keeping the winds light from the Chukchi Sea southward all the way into Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula. And for tonight, stays clear over Kodiak Island, and weak low pressure pushes rain a little farther south along the panhandle, but the southern area staying mostly dry with an increase in the clouds. And dry south central Alaska with light winds all the way up to about the Brooks Range. You start to pick some showers up, and some rain and gusty winds continuing on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, with drier conditions and less wind on the west side up there. Northern Bering Sea, light winds, high pressure, weak high pressure controlling the weather there. So low clouds and fog in areas, but dry conditions, and that low keeps it wet and windy over the central Aleutians, slowly spreading into the Fox Island area to the Pribilofs. And for tomorrow, that front will produce periods of rain and gusty winds, maybe 20 to 30 miles an hour for the Pribilofs. And the Alaska Peninsula, Cold Bay could see gusts 35, maybe 40 miles an hour at the most. Other areas of winds will be lighter. And that band of rain starting to narrow now as the front tends to weaken. Gusty winds and showers for Adak, dry and some clearing out toward the far western Aleutians. And that weak low pressure area pushes rain a little farther south, at least into the central southeast coast. Periods of rain to the north there. Again, another wet day for Yakutat, but dry with some variable clouds for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Sunny again, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, south central Alaska, light winds, temperatures 60s to lower 70s. All the way up into the interior there, and then pick up some clouds, but it looks dry all the way up to the eastern Arctic coast as that moisture shifts eastward into the Mackenzie River Bay and Delta area. And the outlook for Friday, that weakening low pressure slides to the north side of the Alaska Peninsula. The front pushes some light rain up in across Kodiak Island throughout the day, probably reaching the state airport there, Kodiak City, in the afternoon. Light rain developing with thickening clouds, and increasing clouds to a certain extent over the Kenai Peninsula and southern Cook Inlet, with chance of showers in Bristol Bay, chance of light rain with a trough there along the southwest coast. But basically, interior Alaska looking pretty good. A lot of sunshine and dry conditions with light winds, low clouds and fog in the Arctic coast. Kind of showery over the panhandle there. Back to Yakutat, a drier day with just some scattered showers left over. And for the lows tonight, back into the mid to upper 30s from the Bettles area to Kobuk and into the Brooks Range, North Slope, Arctic coastal areas, and right around 40, upper 30s, lower 40s for the Seward Peninsula and Northwest coast. Otherwise, in the 40s again, some areas dropping back into the 30s. Probably won't see the 20s that we saw this morning over southern Alaska, but still a little below normal for those low temperatures at this time of year, down to about 40 or so, upper 30s, Copper River Basin. Much milder over the Panhandle in the 50s, some cases upper 50s out that way. Highs tomorrow, 65 to 75, south central Alaska, 70 75, Copper River Basin, and lower to mid 60s in the Tanana Valley to upper Yukon Valley. Upper 30s for the central Arctic coast, otherwise lower to mid 40s for the north slope to the Brooks Range, upper 60s, lower 70s, Bristol Bay, and 70 to 75 in the southern Panhandle, mid 60s up to the north, and in the 50s out over the Bering Sea, mid 60s, Kodiak Island. Lows on Friday morning, mid to upper 30s from the Arctic coast into the Brooks Range, and 40s south of the Brooks Range to near 50 or into the lower 50s for the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, and 40 to 50 south central Alaska, Kodiak Island, lower 50s, Alaska Peninsula. Mildest conditions in the Panhandle, mid to upper 50s there, followed by highs 65 to 75 for the Panhandle. Also interior Alaska areas, Tanana Valley near.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, a lot of IFR there from the Chukchi Sea and across the northwest coast, western Brooks Range, North Slope, and Arctic coast. Marginal VFR extending down into the Koyukuk Valley and then eastward there to the mid-Yukon Flats area. But VFR, most of southern Alaska, some marginal VFR up over the eastern Copper River Basin, Wrangell Mountain areas there, and then IFR, Yakutat, and along the north and central coast of the Panhandle. VFR, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay to Nunivak Island up into Norton Sound. IFR from the Bering Strait coast, St. Lawrence Island, southward to the Pribilofs, from Amchitka Island eastward to the Alaska Peninsula. And for the afternoon, VFR over much of interior Alaska, Some marginal VFR there for the Kobuk, Selawik Valley areas, Kotzebue, northern Seward Peninsula, northwest coast, and the North Slope, IFR, central and western Arctic coast. IFR, St. Lawrence Island, southward, St. Matthew Island, Pribilofs, and for AKwx, eastward to the western Alaska Peninsula. But VFR, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, and much of the central south, well, all of the central and southwest interior up to the eastern Brooks range, good VFR. Some marginal VFR are trying to get into southern Prince William Sound and then extending over to Yakutat. IFR, a little more widespread over the Panhandle, becoming marginal as you head south to VFR over toward Hyder, Misty Fjords area and Stewart. And for the morning Friday, solid IFR from the Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast, and a band from St. Lawrence Island down across the Pribilofs to the eastern Aleutians and south side of the Alaska Peninsula, southern and eastern Kodiak Island. That IFR zone extends up to trying to get into southern Prince William Sound, not quite making it, staying off the North Gulf Coast, but covering just about all of the Panhandle. Marginal VFR does make it into Resurrection Bay and Prince William Sound. And also out over the west central Bering Sea and Aleutian, some more IFR sliding into Shemya and Attu. For the afternoon Friday, stays VFR, Cook Inlet and the south central Alaska areas, as well as much of the interior there, right up to the Brooks Range. Marginal VFR, Kodiak Island pushing up into Kamishak, Kachemak Bay, southern Cook Inlet, possibly Resurrection Bay. Prince William Sound looks marginal on Friday. Eastward to Yakutat, IFR covering much of the southeast coast and the Gulf of Alaska, as well as the eastern Bering Sea from St. Lawrence Island to the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. And then a band of marginal VFR in between another zone of IFR that pushes into the southwest Bering Sea, Shemya and Attu area, and some IFR for the central and eastern Arctic coast, marginal VFR for the North Slope. Passes. Marginal VFR for both Anaktuvik and Adigan tomorrow at times. Lowest conditions on the northern entrance of both passes. Lake Clark and Merrill, good VFR, rainy VFR, windy VFR day coming up tomorrow and probably the next day as well. Isabel, good VFR. Mentasta, VFR, both south and north entrance. Tanita, VFR. Portage, another VFR day. Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 feet up over the western Brooks Range, western North Slope, down into the Kobuk Valley and Kotzebue, then sloping up to 10 to 12,000 feet, Alaska Peninsula, Aleutians, Kodiak Island, across the North Gulf Coast, and as high as 14,000 feet over the southern Panhandle. And for icing, areas of light to isolated moderate rime or mixed icing for the Arctic coast southward into the northern Kobuk, Koyukuk, and upper Yukon Valley areas. Otherwise, possibly a little bit of icing possible there along the Yukon Delta coast in the northern Bering Sea, but basically icing free central southern Alaska, the Panhandle, and all the Aleutians. Jet stream, southwesterly 70 knots, Alaska Peninsula, westerly 70 to 75 knots, cutting through the central interior areas. And at 9,000 feet, southerlies 25 to 30 knots ahead of that low just north of Atka Island. Across the eastern Aleutians up to Nunivak Island, northerlies 30 knots on the back side of that system, and northwest 40 knots, eastern Arctic coast, west-southwest 25 into the Panhandle. And for 3,000 feet, pretty gusty winds there, eastern Arctic coast, but 30 to 35 knots for the, or around that low, up 40 knots over the central Aleutians. And turbulence-wise, some moderate chop there for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, as well as the west central Aleutians. Amchitka maybe over toward Adak. Light to isolated moderate for the Pribilof Islands.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder. As you well know, you can get forecast information for any day of the week. Today, tonight, tomorrow, out to 6 or 7 days. It includes the high and low temperature, the wind direction, the chance of rain or snow in your part of Alaska. But did you know that there is information available to forecast out to 2 weeks? So the question is, how would you use that information? And here to answer that question today and tell us a lot more about climate services from the U.S. National Weather Service Alaska region is Rick Toman. He's the program manager for the Climate Science and Services. And Rick, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
How would we use information that is out to 2 weeks instead of just the high and low and the chance of rain?
Well, Dave, as we move out in time, of course, forecasts become more uncertain. So as we move into that second week from now, we're not looking at specific highs or lows or precipitation amounts at any given place. What we can do with the state of the science at this point is get a handle on patterns. So we can say things like increased chances for stormy weather in the Bering Sea in 2 weeks, or we've been in a cold weather pattern, looks like 8 to 10 days from now, that pattern's going to change. Those are the kind of forecasts that we can currently make in that second week.
So you're increasing lead time for perhaps big or small weather events and telling us the likelihood of maybe more coastal storms or wind events in some areas?
Those are the kinds of things that that we hope to be able to let Alaskans know in the second week forecast. And if you have an activity or an event that you would find that kind of advance notice useful, whether it's moving stuff off of the beach, whether to go out hunting or to come back from camp, those kind of decisions, the week 2 provides the opportunity for you to get a handle on that kind of information.
Okay. What other type of weather impacts that we're familiar with might Alaskans use climate services for?
Well, in the forecast realm, we can go provide some information from this week 2, say the 8 to 14 day period, on out to the monthly and even seasonal time scale. Now, those monthly seasonal forecasts are still kind of just really very much pattern dependent, and the amount of detail that we can provide at this point is still pretty limited. Generally, indications of how temperature and precipitation will fall in maybe above normal, below normal kind of range. But in the week 2 period, we can be considerably more specific than that as far as the general patterns and really the impacts on Alaskans.
Okay, so we would be talking about generalizations there that would tell us that the period might be more stormy, might be more hot, more dry, more cold, and situations like that.
That's correct. So we're not going to be able to say in which community, for instance, there's the threat of coastal flooding, but we can often be able to tell we're moving into a pattern that would be conducive to big Bering Sea storms. So if you're in an area that could potentially impact you, you'll want to pay attention to the weather forecast.
Okay. Now, every day and every hour of the day, the National Weather Service is working on a forecast for the next day. But how do you start your forecast process for that extended period that goes out beyond 7 days?
Well, the way things work right now, we start off with the expected general flow pattern for Alaska and the whole world, really, and then we narrow that down to Alaska. So we start off with the basic computer model forecast. There's quite a few different computer models that we look at, bring those together. And then another important part of that is we attempt to assess the confidence. The reality is often 2 weeks away, the computer models are very divergent. They have lots of different solutions, and that's an indication that we don't have much confidence. But when we see more agreement in that time frame, and when that agreement is a pattern that will be potentially very impactful for Alaska or is a big change from what we've been in, that's when we can then take that expected pattern. We have computer models forecasting it. We've assessed the confidence. Now we can move that forward. How, using our experience as Alaskan weather forecasters, how does that typically play out for Alaska? So is this a stormy pattern for the Bering Sea? Is this an extra rainy period for Southeast? Is this the kind of pattern that generates strong winds potentially in the Anchorage Bowl? Is this a deep cold pattern for the interior? All of those are the kind of things that we're looking at in these large-scale patterns. That's very different than telling you that the winds on 10 days from now are going to be gusting to 120 on the hillside. We're looking for patterns, not the very specific information that the Weather Service will then hone in on as the event gets closer.
So the idea is to keep the 5, 6, 7 day forecast the same, where you are getting the standard high and low temperature and the chance of wind or rain, but further out you get a broad general forecast, but as the time gets closer to that event, we'll get a lot more specific.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. So how can people use this information if I am out in the bush and I want to see, is a coastal storm expected in my region, or is a chance for that improving over the next 2 to 3 weeks? Where could I go to get information like that?
When we see that potentially impactful or a big change in the weather is coming 8 to 14 days out, typically we will start to highlight that on the Weather Service Facebook site. We might produce a YouTube video highlighting that, linking that on our Facebook site. So often we don't, at this point, we don't have much to say in that because we're really looking for those forecasts of opportunities. But one thing we can say very likely as we go through the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be more and more of this kind of forecast information available in that week 2 time frame.
Okay, and something that emergency managers and city planners and folks in villages might be interested in keeping an eye out for, looking for that information to be headlined, whether that's on social media or perhaps through the National Weather Service channels there to get information from you to make better plans a little bit longer term and make better preparations in the event that things become a little bit more unsettled.
Absolutely. Climate Services with the National Weather Service Alaska region is talking to the state of Alaska every week, apprising them of that 2-week outlook. And on the social media side, we are working to keep Alaskans informed so that when we think we have some confidence in a high impact or a big change, that's the best way right now for folks to find out about that. Twitter, Facebook, so stay tuned to your National Weather Service.
Very good, a developing program. Rick Toman with the National Weather Service Alaska region. He's a Climate Science and Services Program Manager. Thanks so much for joining us again, Rick, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Great, thanks, Dave.
For another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder. We'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And coastal water forecast there for the Panhandle, Central and South Coast for Thursday. Small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots, seas 10 feet. Central and northern inner channels and waters, north winds 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Clarence Strait, southeast wind 15 knots with 3-foot seas. And for the day, Friday, Lynn Canal Glacier Bay, winds will be south at 15 knots. Stevens Passage, light variable to northwest breeze at 10 knots. And Clarence Strait, northwest wind 15 knots. And for the south coast, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas around 7 feet. For the north coast, west-northwest winds 15 to 20 knots, seas 6 feet. And for Prince William Sound, southwest winds 15 knots. Cook Inlet, south to southwest winds of 15 knots. Kamishak Bay, southeast 15 knots, and the Barren Islands, winds will be south at 15 knots. For the North Gulf Coast, west to southwest breeze at 15 knots, seas only 3 feet. And for the day on Friday, small craft advisories for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay as winds kick up to 25 knots from the southeast, seas around 6 feet. Cook Inlet, no change, south to southwest breeze at 15 knots, and Prince William Sound, variable to south winds at 10 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, Middleton Island area, southwest wind 15, and east at 20 for the western North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, south to southwest wind 15 knots for the day Thursday. Small craft advisories for the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 30 knots with seas up to 13 feet. Bristol Bay, southeast winds 20 knots with 3-foot seas. And for Friday, those winds drop off and turn more southerly for the Alaska Peninsula, south with a southerly direction at 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, southeast at 20, and Kodiak Island, south to southeast winds 20 knots with 4 to 9-foot seas. For the Fox Islands, winds will be south to southeast 25 to 35 knots on Thursday with 10 to 15-foot seas. Adak and Atka, lighter winds but still from the southeast 20 to 25 knots, and northwest 25 knot winds in the forecast for Amchitka Island, and small craft advisories Kiska to Shimia, north winds 30 knots, seas 13 feet. And for Friday, west-northwest winds for the western Aleutians at 25 knots, seas just under 10 feet. Adak and Atka, west-northwest 25 knots. And for the Fox Islands, west to southwest winds 20 to 30 knots with 7 to 16 foot seas. For the southwest coast on Thursday, east winds 20 knots. Small craft advisories for the Pribilof Islands, east winds 30 knots, seas up to 11 feet. Small craft advisories also for St. Matthew Island, east winds at 25. St. Matthew Island, east winds at 15 knots with 4 foot seas. And for the day Friday, St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds 15 knots. Yukon Delta Coast, northeast winds 15 knots. And the Kuskokwim Delta Coast winds will be southeast at 20 knots, seas at about 5 feet. North winds at 20 for St. Matthew Island, northeast at 15 for the Pribilofs. And for the eastern Arctic coast tomorrow, east winds 15 to 20 knots, southeast at 10 for the central coast. Small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast all the way down to Wales, south winds 30 knots with seas at about 7 feet. And those drop off pretty good, becoming kind of variable at 10 knots from Wales to Cape Beaufort. Western central Arctic coast, southwest winds diminishing to 15 knots. And for the eastern Arctic coast, winds will be east, 10 to 15 knots. For tonight, low clouds and fog along the Arctic coast and maybe the North Slope with scattered showers along the Brooks Range, especially in the east, scattered showers along the Alaska Range. Otherwise, pretty dry over the interior to the North Gulf Coast, mostly clear over the Panhandle. Wind and rain for the Alaska Peninsula, with rain continuing for the Fox Islands, but winds diminishing, and then kind of a cloudy, foggy, drizzly pattern out over the Aleutians, a little breezy towards Chimionat-2. That low center moves to Atka Island and continues to slowly weaken. The front right along the Alaska Peninsula of the Pribilofs are periods of rain and breezy conditions in those areas. Chance of showers Kodiak Island, also over northern Bristol Bay and the southwest hills. Chance of thunderstorms Alaska Range, eastern interior to the eastern Brooks Range. And the outlook for Friday, scattered thunderstorms for the central and eastern Brooks Range, possibly all the way out to the eastern Arctic coast. And cloudy, cooler, showery conditions across much of southern Alaska, with dry conditions for the Panhandle and also over the western.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.